Welcome, everybody, on behalf of the International Planning History Society. My name is Carola Hein, and the Chair History of Architecture and Urban Planning at TU Delft. And together with Stephen Ramos, who's also on our management team, and a couple of other colleagues, we've been organizing a series on what's in it for planning history, with the idea to shift the focus of planning historians to contemporary issues and challenges, and in this case, notably water. So we've now organized, this is the fourth event we are organizing around this theme of having someone from a field of water speak to planning history and try to shift the research focus. So we are delighted today to have Todd Bridges with us, and Stephen will introduce him more personally.
Thank you, Carola, and thanks to everyone, and welcome to the International Planning History Society webinar series. John and Margaret Gold have recently published an editorial in Planning Perspectives called Planning History and the Environment as a question, because the journal's subtitle is an international journal of planning history and the environment. So across planning and the social sciences in the US, nature and environment have been ever present with our understandings of planning, perhaps so even more than history when compared with other countries. But planning has tended to be urban-centered. River basin planning was the inspiration for regional planning, and engineering at the geotechnical scale enabled regional planning. So engineering is an adjacent discipline to planning, but more than that, it's the medium through which planning often works or doesn't work. Suffice it to say, we need to understand each other better. Perhaps perspectives on themes of nature and history are ones from which we can learn from one another. Today, we have a great opportunity for that. Dr. Todd Bridges is Professor of Practice in Resilient and Sustainable Systems in the College of Engineering at the University of Georgia. Prior to joining UGA in 2023, Dr. Bridges served for 17 years as a senior research scientist for environmental science for the U.S. Army and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Over his 30-year career with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Dr. Bridges led over $250 million in research projects and programs. In 2010, Dr. Bridges founded the Corps of Engineering with Nature program and served as the national lead for that program until 2023. Among his many publications, he helped develop and publish the guidelines on nature and nature-based features for flood risk management. He's received the De Fleury Medal, which is the Silver Order from the Army Engineering Association, from the Army Engineering Association in 2022, as well as the Distinguished Presidential Rank Award from President Biden in 2021. His PhD is in biological oceanography, and he also has degrees in biology, zoology, which of course will help in the nature-informed background. And so we're very lucky to have Dr. Bridges with us. Following his presentation, Dr. Lynn Abdouni will be a discussant to provide some reflections and some questions for Dr. Bridges, and then we'll open things up to a Q&A through the chat. So we hope to have active participation from everyone. But without further ado, in his presentation titled The Past, Present, and Future of Nature and Engineering, please welcome Dr. Todd Bridges.
And very briefly, Stephen, to add on, we also have Tianchen Dai, who will be commenting, and Panglin Zhu. So they will introduce each other afterwards. So welcome to Dr. Bridges, and take it away.
Yes. Hello, everyone, and thank you for this opportunity to gather with you, and I hope to learn a lot about planning history during our dialogue. I hope the slides are the way that they should be. Let me know if they aren't. Okay. I like to think that I have thought a lot about this, and the title is a new one for me to use here, the past and present and future of nature and engineering. And my intention here is to relate what I've been thinking about for some years now to planning. And I look forward to our discussion together in that way. There are a lot of problems, if you will, or challenges that planning, urban planning, engineering are focused on addressing. I've represented a number of different hazards here on the slide, by no means a comprehensive or all-inclusive list, but there are challenges here that are entirely of human origin, industrial disasters or terrorism. And on the other end of the spectrum, there are so-called natural hazards, earthquakes, flooding. And the vast majority, I would submit to you, are combinations of both human decision-making, human action, past and present, and the processes that operate around us within nature. If we consider just the climate and weather related disasters on this slide, our National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, actually tracks climate and weather disasters in the United States. And since 1980, there have been 372 weather or climate disasters in the United States that have produced at least $1 billion in economic damage. So $372 billion plus disasters since 1980 only. I can remember 1980. Some of the people on the call perhaps weren't born yet, but I can remember 1980 quite well. In addition, if you think about just the cumulative damages across just weather disasters in the United States only, the total damages for those events, $2.6 trillion. And in addition to that, in the United States, during those events, 16,000 people were killed by weather. I think those data points illustrate some of the challenges that we have, the magnitude of these challenges, and also some of the needs that we have with respect to upgrading our infrastructure. But we have done a lot with infrastructure, of course, for addressing these hazards, but also to accomplish many other purposes related to economic as well as social purposes. And these are statistics on this slide that illustrate, again, just for the United States, what we built over more or less 100 years, actually substantially less than 100 years, but I call it the century of infrastructure. And many other countries have similar kinds of patterns, but it's hard not to be impressed by those numbers. But I would also point out that as we have engineered across the entire country, collectively, we have all and that leads to a point that I think is apparent to us, and that there really are, what I say here, three parts to the planetary predicament that we are in today. We're constantly, I think, and appropriately exposed to the challenges related to climate change, but we do need to point out that the hazards related to climate have existed for as long as people have existed, right? Flooding was an issue before there was such a thing as climate change. That we understand that we have hazards. Climate change is changing those hazards in largely inconvenient ways, problematic ways, including making more extreme these events and processes. But the third predicament is landscape transformation through engineering. And this is a pattern that we see across the entire planet. I'm going to focus, of course, a lot on what we see in the United States. It's these three parts together that are giving rise to the challenges that we see at increasing scale that we confront both in urban and rural settings across our countries. And I have, when you consider the 90,000 dams that we built in the United States in the 20th century, those dams impound 600,000 miles of river with lots of consequences, because when the country was first colonized by Europeans, or before that period of time, we had about 220 million acres of wetlands that has been estimated in the conterminous United States, the lower 48 states that we say now. Today, we have about 110 million acres of wetlands. So we've managed through engineering to reduce our total inventory of wetlands by half in much less than 200 years, with all sorts of consequences for us, I would submit as well. So, riding on top of this, well, how did this all come about? I'm going to refer to Cynthia Kerner. She's a professor of history at George Mason. She wrote I think, a very interesting book that I ran across in a bookstore one day and bought and read on inventing disaster. And she refers to this culture of calamity that exists within the United States. And this quote, it resonates with me a lot. I'll just read it with you. That our modern approach to disaster is rooted fundamentally in an Enlightenment-inspired confidence in humanity's ability to conquer and control nature. And we attempt to do that through engineering. And it relates even to the very beginnings of this country with the Jamestown colony in 1607. They confronted immediately disaster. In fact, more than 6,000 people came to that colony between 1607 and 1624. And over that period of time, nearly 3/4 of them, or 75% of them, died as a result of various calamities and disasters. In fact, when those colonists first arrived, they didn't know, but tree ring data indicates that they arrived in the United States at exactly the time when that region of our country now was experiencing a 7-year regional drought that was more intense than any drought preceding this, in 700 years, which certainly challenged their ability to farm and produce the food they needed to survive. So let's explore this further with just some specific examples. The deadliest, if you will, natural disaster in the United States was the Galveston hurricane of 1900. This hurricane pushed an estimated storm surge of about 4 meters over the island, when the highest natural elevation on the island at the time was about 3 meters. So about 1 meter above the tallest elevation. And the best estimate is that in this population that lived on Galveston Island in Texas, on the Gulf Coast of the United States, the population was about 40,000 people. Well, 8,000 of those people died in that hurricane. 8,000. There were so many bodies on the island after the waters receded that how to manage those bodies was a serious problem. They tried taking them out to sea and burying them, and they just washed back up on the shore. So funeral pyres burned on Galveston Island for weeks and weeks as bodies were recovered from the debris that was created by this storm. After that, the decision was made, we need to protect ourselves. And that gave rise to what we now call the Galveston seawall, a wall of concrete that's 15 kilometers long. It's 4 meters tall and 4 meters wide at its base, and it protects the leading edge, the front edge of this island. But in addition to that, it was really an island building project, because 16 million cubic meters of sand was dredged, and the middle lower photograph there shows that, was dredged from the surrounding waters and pumped onto the island. Existing structures, really thousands of them, were raised in order to kind of raise this island up. So rather than thinking about maybe this is not a good place for us to live, the decision collectively was made, well, we're going to engineer this place into a better place to live and confront nature's hazards. I'm from California originally, and so a lot of my stories come from California, but San Francisco Bay is another interesting case in point. Following the discovery of gold in California in 1849, that bay underwent substantial modifications by people for really more than 150 years, because as low-tech methods gave rise to high-tech methods, if you will, for gold mining, including hydraulic mining, in which water on industrial scales was sprayed on top of hillsides and mountains and eroding them to be able to collect the gold. And you see that in the upper middle photograph. Billions of tons of sediment was washed out of the mountains and foothills of California into San Francisco Bay. San Francisco itself, the city, was also transformed through engineering. Literally hundreds of acres of the city of San Francisco was built on top of so-called made land. This was wetlands and open bay bottom that was filled in by people so they could build on top of it. And in fact, that had all sorts of consequences in the 1906 earthquake, because the structures which were most heavily damaged in San Francisco during that earthquake were on top of, or built on top of, so-called made land, because they was less structurally stable foundation for those structures. Now there's a concerted effort focused on restoring shoreline in San Francisco Bay. You know, over the 100 years following the discovery of gold, more than 95% of the wetlands on the fringe of that bay were lost due to diking or construction of levees and draining for farmland and other construction. And now with sea level rise and climate change, there's a recognized need for natural sources of resilience for sea level rise and coastal storms. And so investment is being made on a substantial level to restoring those features to the landscape. I'm actually from the middle portion of the state of California, where all the food is grown. The state of California is the #1 agricultural state in the United States, with about $60 billion of annual farm level sales of produce from those farms. And as I was growing up in this Central Valley, in the San Joaquin Valley of California, I will readily confess to you that I was ignorant of the place I was born, ignorant from the sense of its history, until I stumbled across a book in a small used bookstore in my hometown, the book there on the left, The Garden of the Sun, which is a history of the San Joaquin Valley, the southern portion of this Central Valley of California. And the first European to wander into that part of California it was a man by the name of Pedro Fages in the year 1772. And what he saw in that landscape, with extensive flowing rivers and streams and wetlands and abundant wildlife, was a very different landscape than what I grew up in, which is just an expansive agricultural setting that occupies more or less every square foot of the territory in that valley. But in addition to those kinds of features, one of the photos here, the California satellite image in the lower portion of the slide, actually shows a lake in the lower portion of that San Joaquin Valley. It's called Tulare Lake. It was the largest lake west of the Mississippi River in the 19th century. During wet years, that lake could be as large as 1,500 square kilometers in size. But gold miners, when the gold began to become more difficult to find, kind of transferred their hydrologic engineering expertise from gold mining to farming through irrigation, and diverting the water that comes out of Sierra Nevadas to the purpose of agriculture. And billions of dollars have been invested in the 20th century in water engineering in California. I think probably the most audacious water engineering on the planet, to be able to create this agricultural landscape. But even then, Mother Nature can overcome it. And this year, Tulare Lake, as it has in other years, is emerging again on the landscape. It had been extinguished, actually erased from the landscape through engineering at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century to diversions of water for agriculture and also the construction of major dams in the Sierra Nevadas. So the largest lake in the west of the United States was disappeared through engineering. And this year, flooding this year has overcome a large portion of that engineering. Mother Nature is persistent. These experiences have occurred elsewhere in the world, of course. I'm highlighting some quotes from the Netherlands here, from a New York Times article from last fall. During the drought experienced in 2022, quoting this blueberry farmer in the Netherlands, "We are world champions in making land dry through engineering," I would add. "Now we are trying to turn that system around because we overshot." So there's a disconnect between current circumstances and engineering of the past. You might say engineering legacy, planning legacy. And Dr. Zolzman, a policy virus of DINIA, who says, there's nothing natural about the Netherlands. I would say there's nothing natural, if you will, in the strict sense of any place that people occupy today, because of the transformation we have imposed through our collective action that we refer to commonly as engineering. But people have been doing this a lot and for a long period of time, including Native Americans, the people that were here before Europeans came to North America, through the use of fire, for example. For hundreds, if not thousands of years, people in North America were using fire to transform the landscape. And in this particular case, for the purpose of protein. There were no domestic animals that were ranched or farmed by native people in North America, but they transformed the landscape through the use of fire to create grasslands that were beneficial to their sources of protein, like deer and elk and other herbivores. An early Dutch settler, for example, commented on this in his writing on the Hudson and the Mohawk rivers. He said, such a fire is a splendid sight when one sails on the Hudson and Mohawk rivers at night while the forest is ablaze on both banks. These fires were not of natural origin. People were creating these fires to shape the ecosystem for their benefit. And this happened across much of the United States. So humans have been shaping landscapes for long periods of time. In the modern era, I think it was recognized increasingly that things maybe were out of balance. And we can trace these thoughts back to the 1960s. H.T. Odum, who coined the phrase ecological engineering, a practice that continues to this day, of combining kind of the ecological with human engineering intention to arrive at a more harmonious, if you will, outcome, but also some distinctive purposes in mind. And his brother, Gene Odum, at the University of Georgia, and their graduate students have worked for decades in this space. And then Ian McHarg, in the context of architecture and landscape architecture and urban planning, and his seminal work, I would say, Design with Nature, published in 1969, the same kind of idea. In this quote from the introduction written by Lewis Mumford, that McHarg's emphasis is not on either design or nature by itself, but upon the preposition with. How do we combine human engineering and nature in ultimately a beneficial way? Maybe not using the terms sustainable or resilient, but those would be the modern concepts that we would add perhaps to that statement today. Flash forward 50 some odd years. In 2022, President Biden issued an executive order on Earth Day. That executive order was titled Strengthening the Nation's Forests, Communities, and Local Economies. But the fourth section of that executive order I've highlighted here was entitled Deploying Nature-Based Solutions to Tackle Climate Change and Enhance Resilience. And this launched the federal government to a whole range of activities, including the preparation of this report that I've noted here on the slide, Opportunities to Accelerate Nature-Based Solutions, a roadmap. And In this context, nature-based solutions are described as actions to protect, sustainably manage, or restore natural or modified ecosystems to address societal challenges, simultaneously providing benefits for people and the environment. Back in 2010, as was noted in the introduction, I started with a team, a program in the Army Corps of Engineers that we called Engineering with Nature. So back in 2010, the term nature-based solutions had not been invented, something that actually has a much more recent origin within the last few years. But that was the intent of this program, to highlight opportunities to combine or to integrate the natural with the engineered into a better value proposition, if you will, through a whole range of activities, from research to full-scale implementation. Nature-based solutions, this is my shorthand definition of it. We're conserving or restoring or engineering nature for the benefit of people and nature. And that preposition "and" is very important here. And examples of this could include coastal storm risk management, by restoring, perhaps, or expanding or supporting an island wetland complex so that we can attenuate storm surge or waves. Or in an inland environment, in a river environment, restoring inland floodplains to provide more space for water. Surface heat reduction by greening urban settings. But there are other applications with respect to drought and wildfire, or water resilience generally, or climate mitigation through carbon sequestration. There's a whole variety of terminology which can somehow complicate, if you will, communications about this topic. But I think it's a very vibrant area of work that we see ongoing today. And even in modern times, what I would say kind of during the phase of modern engineering in the 20th century, nature-based solutions were evident in the landscape. I think this project, the Yolo Bypass in California, is probably the original Make Room for the Rivers project. It was authorized by the US Congress in 1911. It's a series of weirs constructed structures along the river, which represent kind of outlets. That is, they divert floodwaters off of the river onto the historic floodplain. In this case, nearly 60,000 acres of floodplain, which at times when the water is running very high are purposefully inundated by diverting water onto this 60,000 acres of land. 75% of that land is privately owned, so it's inundated through easements or arrangements with those landowners. But 16,000 acres of that comprise the Yolo Bypass wildlife area. Floodplain habitat for birds and recreating people. It's a beautiful space. And this was a necessary action because of the intensity of flows on the Sacramento River, which made it clear that a levees-only approach was never going to work for that system. Another example would be this project in Fort Pierce City Marina in Florida, which was destroyed in Hurricane Francis in 2004. They needed a new protection structure. And rather than some sort of rubble mound breakwater or concrete wall, they built essentially an archipelago of islands. 20 acres of these islands, which have been planted with mangroves. They have dunes built on them, and seagrass has been planted, and oyster has been restored to the system. A very different looking and functioning protection system for this marina. On the other end of the spectrum, I visited this project a couple of years ago. It's a park in the greater Phoenix, Arizona area. It's 110 acres. It has 7 constructed ponds on it. This was former farmland that was taken, purchased, and converted into a park, and 7 constructed ponds that receive 100% of the water in those ponds comes from the city's wastewater treatment facility. Up to 10 million gallons a day of water from that treatment facility flow into these ponds. The purpose is to recharge groundwater beneath the park. Water is a relatively scarce resource in Arizona, thus the focus on restoring groundwater within this region. And This project's been operating for 20 years. It's a perfect example of a nature-based solution. It's providing social value for the people. It's providing environmental value for the 300 species of birds that utilize this habitat, and it's providing engineering value in the form of restored aquifer in the area. There's a lot of evidence building on how nature-based solutions can function and provide these diverse values. I've listed some of them here. Physical modeling, like you see the wave flume operating here, looking at how wetland structures, wetland vegetation affects the orbital velocities of waves. Engineers need those data to be able to design how a wetland and restored wetland can function in attenuating waves and the damage that waves can produce. Advances in numerical modeling or the study of natural analogs. You don't have to build a wetland to be able to study how a wetland works, for example. Scale demonstrations of a whole variety of types have been performed and are being performed around the world. Full sources of knowledge and experience, including traditional ecological knowledge. But what headed the list there for me, is history. I have just one book here, The Dreamt Land by Mark Arax, about the history of agriculture and the Central Valley of California. We need to understand what the system was before we can understand what it is today and maybe what it should be tomorrow. So just a few final points on planning for what I call here unengineering. There aren't really any blank canvases for us to plan or engineer today. And a lot of what we need to do, the challenge in front of us is how to undo things that humanity has done in the past. That's my phrase here of unengineering. So I'm going to run through this list of nature first thinking, multi-purpose benefits, guidance, and storytelling. And I have a picture here of the largest dam removal project in U.S. history is underway right now in the Klamath River on the border between California and Oregon. And then this is the first dam that has been completely removed as of about just a few weeks ago, Copco number 2. And you can see the before and the after there. So let's hit these points quickly. I and many others would submit that our planning and our designing need to proceed with what I call here nature first thinking. What is the landscape? What was the landscape? What does Mother Nature, if you will, intend with respect to that landscape? What can we do to support those functions that are consistent with how we want to occupy or use or interact with that landscape? Within the Engineering with Nature program, we have worked for many years with landscape architects, bringing landscape architects and engineers together in different project contexts to focus on, okay, the natural part of the system, how we can combine the natural with the engineered into a more sustainable and resilient system. And you can go to this link here at the bottom of the slide and download these reports that show these case examples of how that space has been explored. We also need to do a much better job, and I think it's not just the United States, but around the world, of capturing the diversity of benefits that combined natural and engineered systems can produce. And the Engineering with Nature program, we organized and co-organized a summit last fall in November, actually, at the National Academy of Engineering in Washington, D.C., that we called Measuring What Matters. And it brought together practitioners from across the United States for a day to focus on this idea of revealing and exposing, understanding the diversity, the multi-purpose benefits that nature-based solutions can provide. How can we incorporate that diversity of benefits more actively into our decision-making processes through things like benefit cost analysis or other rubrics, if you will, that inform decision making. And our Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works in the Corps at the time, one of the quotes I captured that he said there that day was, "We can't value everything, but we need to value what we can," as opposed to, ignoring whole categories of social, environmental, and engineering value that can be created by our actions. We need to develop technical guidance for practitioners around the world, and this was also referenced in the introduction. So we worked for 5 years across the country and the world. We made at least 2 trips, I think, to the Netherlands during this particular project, but other places, England and the United States. And we produced a 1,000-page technical guide on how to use what we would call now nature-based solutions, what we called in this context, natural and nature-based features for flood risk management. So drawing together practice and experience from 170 authors and contributors from a whole range of organizations, public, private, knowledge institutions from around the world. And this document can be accessed and downloaded online as a PDF, and it has been downloaded more than 8,000 times since 2021 when we published it. In fact, it's the most downloaded resource on the Corps of Engineers library to this day. There's a strong interest in these kinds of approaches. One of my final points here is that we collectively, I think, need to reinvest or invest more in storytelling to spark conversation and thinking and new ideas. And we've done that. We did this deliberately within the Engineering with Nature program. We produced a series of atlases, books to show people what these kinds of projects look like in the United States and other places in the world. Again, these can be downloaded free. We started a podcast to engage in conversation. We invested a lot in a website, of course, but I started doing some travel blogging a couple of years ago to be able to share my experiences when I visited places and people and projects around the country. But again, I think all of us as practitioners and as academics, I think need to invest in this idea of storytelling, to be able to relate to people as well as fellow practitioners, to discover ways in which we should be planning and engineering better in the future. And this is my last slide. And the reason why I'm at the University of Georgia now, after spending 30 years with the Army Corps of Engineers, back in 2017, 2018, UGA formed the Institute for Resilient Infrastructure Systems. And you can see that its vision is really at the centerpiece of this idea of combining the natural and the conventional engineering that we associate with infrastructure and working together for communities, for businesses, and for natural systems. And we're working across the full scope of campus, really, of the institution, engineers and ecologists and designers and lawyers and anthropologists, and the list kind of goes on, working together, 50 faculty and 60 graduate students, a number of collaborative research projects. But if you're interested in what we're doing here, I would invite your attention to our network for Engineering with Nature, where institutions can join in this collaborative effort to share experience and join together in projects. And so with that, I'll conclude. I look forward to our discussion, and I'll stop sharing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was fabulous. This was a great overview, and I've got lots of questions. So I'm happy. Well, I will follow up after letting our colleagues speak first. So I don't know if Lynn, if you want to start and your camera is not yet on. Yes, there you are. And Stephen is also there, Tian Chen and Pang Min. Maybe you guys want to, Lynn, why don't you kick us off with your comments, reflections first?
Yes, absolutely. Can everybody hear me okay? Awesome. Well, good morning. Thank you, Todd. And thank you, Carola. Stefan, nice to see you. Todd, this was fantastic. So I have a few things because we're talking about, history in general. So a lot of what you talked about does inform this relationship between engineering and planning and landscape architecture, you know, really branching across disciplines. But I want to go back and really focus on a few points that you touched on in passing, which are the traditional ecological knowledges and how do we not control but work with nature. A lot of this knowledge is new, we're developing it, but a lot of this knowledge has also been existent. We just have not documented it in a mainstream way. And you talked about people and you talked about storytelling, and I want to add to that oral history in general. How do you really, you know, bring these knowledges that we know but just has been on the fringes so far? So my first question was like, it is a question, but then how can we borrow from some of those centering nature and people to develop history? I don't mean to revise history, but to develop this other narrative in history, to really know where we came from. You know, Maya Angelou is telling us to know where we came from, but how do we really borrow some of these techniques? So this is looking at the past and looking at the future. And this is more like, I'm curious, Todd. So we have engineering with nature, and then you mentioned a lot of the current administration in the US supporting engineering with nature. But how do we develop bipartisan support? Because we need to keep moving forward. And I don't know what the next elections are going to look like, but I wanted to see how can you develop a language that permits reaching across both aisles.
Okay, I'm glad I had a pen so I could write down your question. You know, I think there's a lot of interest in the United States in accessing what I've called TEK, you know, traditional ecological knowledge. And I think that the challenge of a technical nature that relates to us is how do we combine traditional ecological knowledge as evidence with what we might think of as Western science as a source of evidence? And how do we create, you know, a footing, you know, for these different ways of knowing to inform decision making? I think that's a significant challenge. I believe that social scientists, broadly defined, have techniques and practices that will allow us to do that. But that does require, I'm going to say, scientists and engineers to stretch themselves a little bit, you know. And I think this is going to be a very exciting area of work in the decades to come. I mean, I visited the Santa Clara Pueblo in New Mexico last year and spent the day with the governor of the Pueblo and his people. You know, we're having lunch together, and he, you know, it makes an impression on you when you're talking with somebody who says, my people have been here for 10,000 years. And we know this land and how it works, you know. And the challenge, I guess I would just go back to, okay, how do we, well, first you have to talk to people. You know, you have to have some relationship, and then you can have a basis for sharing, and try to kind of tap into how they know, you know, and what is it that they know, and how we can combine that with engineering. So that's, I guess, my response to that. But you do have to talk to people, because Governor Chevarria and his staff, you know, they're not going to be publishing journal papers, right? So this is another issue, right? So if you're in a knowledge institution, or if you're an academic, you know, this is one of our main channels that we communicate, but that cannot be the only channel that we use to communicate with other people, right? Because we're going to be missing whole areas of knowledge if that's the only way we communicate, is by throwing another paper over the wall, you know, at somebody else. So that's why I emphasize storytelling. And I think some people are going to be more naturally inclined, because of their personality, to engage in multiple channels of communication. Like, not everybody's going to be on board with starting a podcast. That's fine. You know, you can't force people into areas that they're just never going to be comfortable in. But I do think we need to stretch ourselves. And then on the bipartisan, you know, there's a whole range of political philosophies there, but I have yet to encounter, and I've had discussions and interactions with elected officials across a very wide spectrum. I don't feel challenged in talking with any of them. I think one of the lessons or advice I would give is to avoid getting in your own way when you're talking with somebody else, maybe somebody that you don't necessarily agree with, from a political, philosophical point of view. Well, don't get in your own way by bringing up topics that are only going to, distract from your main point. Because I think there are very practical and important aspects of what we're trying to achieve with combining nature and engineering that I don't really think matter with respect to where you fall on the political spectrum. Some things are going to matter more to some people than others, and that's fine. Focus on what matters to them, not what matters to you, when you're talking to them about how to advance these approaches. That's my initial response to your 3 questions.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, thank you, Lynn. Sorry. Go, Stephen.
Oh, I was going to say perhaps thank you to Lynn, and is Tian Chen the next who will be a discussant to invite her to share thoughts and questions as well.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, Todd, and it's a very fascinating speech, very inspiring. I am a associate professor in the School of Design in East China Normal University in Shanghai, and I'll be soon changing my position and moving to Shenzhen, but also in the School of Design. So as a person or academic person from the background of design, I'm very interested in what do you think is the role of this designer in this planning practice? It's like you've mentioned engineering, the nature, and also design with nature. You've showed us loads of very fascinating examples of how people have designed the nature in the past, and some are like failure and some are successful or very inspiring tradition that we could maybe learn from for the future. So when we are designing for the future, how do you see the relationship between different stakeholders in this ongoing process? Like how do you see this communication between planners and the government, and also maybe the users, we say local communities, residents, and also planning historian. So do you, how do you see these the negotiations between these stakeholders? How do you think these communication can inspire and inform the final decision making for the design? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question and your thoughts. I guess if I had to sum up my my thoughts about how to proceed or what we're trying to achieve in regards to the points that you raised, I would use the word balance. That we have to have more balance. So you can think of this in terms of, okay, the team, those who are collectively working together on a project or a series of projects, that in the past, let's say 75 years ago, an infrastructure project would only have included engineers, period. There would have been no other room for any other type of professional practitioner in that project. It would have been engineers and only engineers. In addition to the fact they brought up private all male, that would have been another thing you would have observed. So I think in respect to the teams or the people that are coming together over a project, we need to have more balance in these project teams. I gave a talk a few years ago in the Netherlands to a group of engineers and engineering and construction companies, What I said, I see a future in which all of your companies employ social scientists and they're a part of every one of your projects. They probably aren't now part of your projects. And I'm excluding economists from this because that's a special breed of social scientists. But I mean psychologists and social workers and public health professionals that you're going to employ them and they're going to be on your team, right? Because those disciplines are going to matter because people are looking for those kinds of values and benefits and outputs from what we engineer. So we have to have disciplinary or balance, I guess. And designers, to your point, designers need to have a bigger role than I think they occupy now. Let's say in an infrastructure project, whether it's a road or a bridge, but I'm going to talk about like water projects, designers, architects, landscape architects must have a larger role in those projects earlier in those projects before they become too channeled into a particular type of solution. I have a close colleague in the Corps of Engineers. He's actually an economist and planner. He says, you do not want your engineer designing your project, you know, but they will if you let them, you know. And so that's I guess part of my point. The other, you know, stakeholders in that balance again, whereas in years past, I get 50, 75 years ago, there was no room for stakeholders in any kind of project decision making. They had no seat at the table. And as somebody once told me, you know, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. Yeah. And so now we have to find a way to engage stakeholders more substantively. Just because you're at the table doesn't mean anybody's listening to you, right? Or processing what you're saying. So I think the next phase of, okay, it's good that you assembled some stakeholders. Now we have to demonstrate we're actually substantively engaging them. We're hearing them and we're actually incorporating what we're hearing from them into projects. And that's not straightforward to do. A bit of advice for designers, and I hear this, and I'm sure you hear this too, that sometimes designers kind of set themselves up because their designs are too fantastic. You know, they look too much like fantasy, and engineers and others, they can't see how to go from where we are today, A, to Z, that design. How do you get there, right? So, so maybe, you know, thinking about, is the project a fantasy? And that has its own purpose, of course, by challenging thinking and such. Or is it really something that we think we can get to? Well, how would you get there from here? You know, given how much unengineering is going to have to be done to be able to get there. So that was a long response, but that's the response I give.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tianchen. Our next discussant is Penlin Zhu, who is joining us. Penlin, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So let me first introduce myself briefly. I'm still a PhD student with Carola. I'm trying to finalize my thesis and expect for defense early next spring. So my question for your great presentation is, I found it very interesting to look at the concept of nature engineering, because I found that there is already a dialectic relations between the word engineering and nature. If we think nature as an untouched, innocent concept, and engineering is a way that human beings craft and put installations on top of this innocence. So in this way, I would like to ask, how could we balance, or how could you balance in the design process, is that first, either we're going to make engineering more nature, and that is to say that we're trying to involve nature elements, processes, or principles into, let's say, engineering design, or we can also make, in a way, the nature more engineering, and engineering that it's to enhance nature processes or to meet human needs. So human problems. So what's the balance in between of these two? And that's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. We could spend a lot of time talking about this because it's not an either or proposition, either engineering or nature. Of course, there's a spectrum here. There's a range, and one way to think about it is in terms of, okay, well, how much in this, whatever design or intention you want to bring out, how much engineering or force through engineering am I going to have to impose to bring that out? And I think frequently, the more force we have to impose through engineering, the less natural the outcome is going to be. And I think a lot of this is unfortunately, coming to a head right now when you think about, say, dam construction around the world, right? And it's easy to maybe not think about it too much when you're building a dam that, hey, even concrete wears out. And that's going to be a challenge for countries, including the United States, to a very significant degree, because these projects now are to the phase where, and the time where these projects, it's not just going to be Derna, Syria, where dam failures are going to kill people. I mean, it's going to happen in lots of places because these projects are going to fail. So that's one way of thinking about it, because the more force, if you will, you're having to impose on the natural system, the more attention you're going to have to give to it over time, because it's going to have to be repaired. It's going to require constant attention because, if you will, Mother Nature wants it one way, and we've said no, we want it a different way. And that's where I think the concepts of sustainability and resilience, which are complementary to each other, come into play. Is this really a sustainable solution? We need to be realistic about what engineers will call the operating and maintenance costs of a particular system are going to be through time. There is no build it and walk away system, right? It may not be in your professional lifetime or in your lifetime at all that this is going to be a problem, but when it is a problem, it's going to be very expensive, to fix. So I guess that's my initial response to you. This is not to say that we can get by with just planting a bunch of flower beds, of some garden. I mean, that's not, and I think everybody here knows that, and we need to, of course, respectfully challenge, any of our engineering colleagues that want to pretend like what we're talking about is just creating a bed of flowers someplace and calling it engineering. Now, that's not what we're talking about. Because there are some ways in which I think we can use technology. In fact, I just had a conversation with some colleagues recently about how might we use some material science to actually aid or increase the amount of carbon sequestration we can achieve in natural systems. For example, soils would be a way of combining technology with nature to achieve something together.
Great, thank you.
Well, this is really fascinating. I have to say, I cannot help myself, but also put in a question or comment myself while everybody else think. And please do raise your hand, and so that we can go on with questions. There's two things that fascinate me, and I will just frame it a bit. We've been at the UN conference on water in the beginning of this year. And out of the 800 plus commitments made at the conference, some 200 or so refer to the past, history, heritage, in whatever ways. But nobody really knows how exactly to do it. And so when you were saying before, well, what do we do with the past? So I put this in the chat. I've tried to phrase it as three ways. One is to understand the systems of the past and see if we can learn from the system, if these systems can inspire us. to understand where we went wrong and where we have to dig our out of the hole first before we can do something new, and then to see what heritage also to preserve, because there may be elements we don't want to challenge. And so when you were saying that to respect all the values that we, to value what we have, I think that was really, it's really inspirational. And we've gotten into a similar way. So that's why I put this new journal, Blue Papers, and I would love to have even your talk here now in the paper. But we've been trying to go for a value case approach in our recent, we've made a course on this. And so this is more a comment than a question yet, but the fact of what you were saying, every water manager should, or approach should have social scientists, and I would even say humanities scholars on board. That's really how to do it. The question is how, and how to get them there, and what tools humanities and social science can actually have to make this happen. And so we really need to also think the academic culture around this. So if you have any suggestions and ideas where you could say, hey, here is something that humanities scholars, to challenge you even more than the social scientists, could bring about to engage the water managers and the water engineers.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think as I indicated, the reason why I'm at UGA is because of this institute, the Institute for Resilient Infrastructure Systems, and it was immediately obvious to me when I first began interacting with them in about 2018 that they had created a special set of conditions to be able to get that much interdisciplinary interaction, even at a university, I have found is rare. Because universities have just as many walls as other places, right? When we create boundaries between departments and schools and colleges at an institution, we create a wall that we have to overcome in order to interact with one another. But that's the way we organize human systems. You have to have some way of organizing, or you can't do anything, I guess. But anytime you have a boundary or a wall, you create an impedance. You create an obstacle that has to be overcome to have some exchange. So they've been within IRIS very careful about trying to cultivate a culture, as Brian Bledsoe, the director, says, where disciplines look up to each other, not down at each other. And this relationship can take a whole variety of different forms, right? Engineers, they create, in a sense, a condition that creates an obstacle for interacting with them, because if you don't have 3 semesters of calculus, we can't really relate to you. Well, I'm sorry, you're not going to get a psychologist or a social worker, or an anthropologist to take 3 semesters of calculus. So we have. I understand that engineers and scientists use numbers as a part of how we communicate with each other, but that can't be the limit of it. So I think we in academia need to be thinking actively about boundaries, why boundaries exist, and how we can overcome them. And we need to spend more time with each other. Yes, we might have to walk to another part of campus, but I think if we can spend time actually talking with each other I think we'll find that there's value in actually working together, on some of these important topics. And I think the human, my bottom line here, Carol, is something that designers get that maybe other disciplines don't, is that the human factor is the dominant factor everywhere, in these problems. It just is. Engineers and scientists, as a general rule, kind of hide from that reality. A lot of them do. I shouldn't say most. A lot of them hide from that reality by hiding behind their data or their tables or their numerical models or other things. But that has created some of the problems that we have in the legacy of this engineering from the last century that we're confronting now. Is And many of those projects, maybe we could point out many cases where the dominant human factor was omitted from those projects. It wasn't even allowed into it. And now we're dealing with some of the consequences of that.
Yeah. Yeah, perfect. I mean, I hand it over to you, Stephen, in a second, but I always come back to the motto of TU Delft, which is technology for a better society, which makes me always think of, before we make those mathematical models, and there's no doubt that these are meaningful and engineering is meaningful, but we first have to ask about the values that even make us need these models, and if there couldn't be other solutions. So yes, thank you. This is and this center sounds very inspiring. I didn't know much about it, but let's see, Stephen.
Thank you, Carola. I didn't mean to interrupt, but Todd, if I can ask a question as well. Last October, Carola and colleagues convened this new waterway conference, which you know, and a big part of that was understanding dredging going forward, and the multiple stakeholders and even species stakeholders that those decisions involve. And to sort of give a more local, concrete example, or at least local for me, the Savannah port had these debates around dredging. Recently was asked to be dredged 48 feet, but environmentalists and certain pushback pushed it to 47 feet instead. But now it looks like they're going forward and going to try to dredge to 51 feet to accommodate the new ships that are coming. It's fairly predictable, and I'm guessing that this will happen all along the Atlantic coast, as it will. Do you envision a point in which, say, the Corps, as the national, in addition with Congress and the national funding sources for these projects, has some kind of pushback or requirements that are more in line with the visions that you have for how these teams could come together in ways that address what historically has been this sort of almost unquestioned economic imperative that drives a lot of these decisions, which is to say, where does an intervention begin to alter the status quo and history of those processes towards the practices that you're showing that are really inspirational, sort of moving forward? How might that happen, say, in the Savannah project, that could be exemplar for others?
Yeah, I think I was looking something up where you were talking. I'm actually giving a webinar I just put into the chat in I guess 2 weeks for the Western Dredging Association on sediment management in the 21st century. The process is already underway, Stephen, for the transformation. I think the question and concern for me is just how long is it going to take for us to get to the end state that we need to arrive at? Because dredging, honestly, is kind of a fantastic example of imposing human will on the natural system. That's what it is. Nature, if you will, is putting sediment where we don't want it, and so we're removing. So it's a classic case of engineering battling with natural systems. And there are really good examples of people just deciding, hey, we're going to create a port here, and literally creating a port from nothing. And engineers said, well, we don't have the conditions here, we'll just create them. There's no natural embayment or anything, we'll just make it. And when you impose, again, back on my point, the more force you're having to impose to create this condition, probably the more force you're going to have to impose over time to maintain it. So I think we need to also look for, I think, more natural or nature-based approaches, even when it comes to things as very practical as dredging and sediment management. Last year, well, in fact, it wasn't last year, it was just this year, the chief of engineers, so the 3-star general who heads the agency, that has 38,000 employees in it, the Corps of Engineers. General Scott Spellman committed the Corps of Engineers to a national goal for beneficial use of sediment that it dredges. For the first time in the organization's history, we now have a national goal to use 70% of all the sediment that we dredge, which amounts to more than 200 million cubic meters a year, to beneficially use 70% of that sediment by the year 2030. And that's going to take a lot of innovation to get there. But beneficial use in this might be, well, we're going to restore this island here, or we're going to create this wetland over here, or other, because sediment is in a sense, kind of the material, the currency that natural systems are built with, it naturally or otherwise, along rivers and in estuaries and along coastline. So that's a significant mark of progress. I told my wife when this came out this past winter, that evening when I saw his memo come forward, I said, I think I could actually cry right now. This is such a significant event for an organization like the Corps to make this kind of commitment at that level. So the transformation is underway, Stephen. It's just, how difficult are we going to make it for ourselves to actually get to the end state that is required? In fact, I'm going to a meeting this morning for the next couple of days of the Atlantic Intercoastal Waterway Association that concerns itself with the maintenance of a navigation system along the coast of the United States on the East Coast that is significantly used by recreational boaters, but also commercial, to talk about some of these issues of how do we get to 70% beneficial use by 2030, and to create these kind of triple bottom line, outcomes with dredging. But I think dredging is a great example because it is, really a classic case of trying to impose our will on Mother Nature through engineering in the form of ships, that move sediment around.
Thanks, Todd.
And maybe even it's working against the currents in some way, literally with the sediments, and as you say, impose, but it's also our consideration of what is waste, because coming from Hamburg, there were entire villages that were wiped out to deposit the sludge. And I mean, there's one church standing as the only remainder, and everything else has been covered up. So if we could see this not as as dirt, as waste, but as a product to do something with. And I had a conversation recently with someone here on the in the water management sector, and they said they were even thinking, so they are pressing it into clays that, for example, that could be used for streets or something like that. So there must be, rather than seeing it as waste product, seeing it as the beginning of something new. I think that would be really very cool.
Yeah. I mean, and it's in my talk this week. I relate. What is an empty aluminum can, whether it's a soft drink or it's beer? Well, if you deposit it in a landfill, it's a waste. If you recycle it and it becomes part of the skin of a new 777, aircraft, well, it's a resource. The same with sediment. You throw it away, it's a waste. If you recycle it into something that has value, it's a resource. So what are we going to do? And I think with respect to things like climate change and other matters related to things that we were talking about today, it's clear to me that we need to all be striving for 100% beneficial use. We shouldn't be throwing away any of it. It's vital for our landscapes and to support our landscapes so that our landscapes support us with respect to sea level rise and climate change. And so I'm making it a point, Carola, to challenge more aggressively my friends in the port sector I'm not accepting their argument anymore that, well, it's going to cost us, 3% more, to beneficially use this sediment. It's going to cost us a nickel more to do this. No, that's not good enough. I'm sorry. We need to find innovative ways to make productive use of this material. It's too precious to not.
I really think this is important, and it's about structures that haven't been set up. And once they have been set up, they become self-fulfilling. I mean, the Dutch dredging industry is huge. Well, what are you going to do with all these machines? And our colleague Han Meyer is arguing for just let the new waterway sealed up. So there's just the machinery, the money, the knowledge that has gone in a certain sector is also driving how we continue doing this. But maybe just to make a turn back to planning history, I think from what we've heard now too, it's about rethinking even the plans that have already been studied, and to look at the degree to which nature-based solutions may already have been in there. Did Ebenezer Howard or even Frank Lloyd Wright, Le Corbusier, all our famous classics included? Or Stephen, you just did the special issue. Well, could we look at all these plans again and say, hey, in the past, not with this name, but this idea of building with nature is my hunch, was already present. We've been reading over it, we've been missing it, we have not. So I think there's even ways of looking at historical documents in a novel way, and also thinking, as you said, traditional knowledge and traditional ways of channeling water, etc., that we should be bringing back under the theme of planning. Because if we can change, as from history, the historical perspective, the notion on what is planning, planning could not only be engineering, it could also be facilitating nature to get to nature-based solutions. I think then we could also have impact on the teaching of planning itself.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I think, engineering became cheap when we transitioned from the steam engine to the use of the internal combustion engine and the availability of fuel. So we just kind of ran amok, with large-scale engineering when engineering became cheap. There are probably many examples of so-called engineering with nature before that transition from steam engine to internal combustion engine, when engineering was out of reach for us, once upon a time. But yeah, how do you exercise some self-control and seek the more elegant solution, a little more jujitsu and a little less yellow steel.
Let's go with Aikido, but I'm just looking at the screen. Any other comments? Because we're also starting to run out of time. Stephen, did you have or anybody else? Just looking at the screen again.
I do know that Todd has a hard stop at 10, so I definitely want to respect his time. But wait, Chang, do you have a question?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I have a question about as far as I know, there are many methods for sustainable infrastructure development, like blue and green infrastructure and low impact development. So I'm really curious about for the historical distance or historical cities, when we try to put this method in these cities. So is there any possible maybe this construction for the ecological sustainable, but it's bad for the historical value? So I'm really curious about this point.
So I think if I'm understanding your question, are there maybe some conflicts between what we're talking about? Sustainable kind of practices going forward? Is that?
I think the question is about this concept of blue-green infrastructure. And I'm not sure that it's as defined as you're presenting it. So I'm wondering, what do you understand green infrastructure and how that could be applied?
Yeah, I made passing note to the fact that there's a lot of different language and terminology that has arisen over the last, let's say, 10 years in this space. And it can be, and maybe to some degree is, a bit confusing. What does somebody mean when they say green infrastructure or blue-green infrastructure? How does that compare to, say, what people mean when they say nature-based solutions? I think this is maybe an example where examples can be very helpful, where people say, you know, when I'm using this term, here's the definition, but here are examples of this practice. That usually brings a more tangible quality to it. I mean, there is no world police here, you know, so we're going to continue to be challenged, I guess, by the fact that different places and different disciplines and practitioners are going to be using different kinds of terms and language to describe, in essence, this idea of kind of combining kind of natural systems more effectively with engineered or designed systems. Because it was kind of, where did the Corps of Engineers come up with this term natural and nature-based features? Well, it came up with one of these conflicts over terms, because after Hurricane Sandy in 2012, there was a lot of interest in green infrastructure. And one of our leaders within the Corps of Engineers said, I have no idea what that means. That sounds like a bumper sticker to me. I don't know what that means in terms of engineering. And so to help bring, I guess, specificity to this, the Corps, we began using this term natural and nature-based features. These are features that either mimic or in fact are, you know, already existing in the landscape, and we want to figure out how to use them more effectively to achieve an engineering outcome. And that settled the situation down a little bit. But the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency still uses the term green infrastructure, but they apply it very specifically to stormwater management methods, like detention ponds and rain gardens and things of this nature. So language is important. Maybe we also need to involve linguists in our list of practitioners to engage, you know, in this space. But I guess that's my response.
Sounds good.
Thank you very much. Stephen, do you want to conclude? Because I think we really should wrap up. But in any case, Todd, it's been really a delight and a pleasure, and I hope we will get a chance to follow up shortly.
Yeah,
thank you.
Yeah, Carol.
I just want to reiterate my thanks to Todd for joining us, for the discussants and their provocative questions. And I think it really helped to unpack the discussion. It is recorded, luckily, and so it will be on the IPHS YouTube channel with the other from the series. But the resources you included, Todd, in your presentation definitely are worth following up with for everyone. I think it's just fantastic things happening, institutional changes that are going to have wide-ranging impacts, which I think are really exciting in that way. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Todd. Thank you, Carola. Thank you, discussants. And thanks everyone else for joining us. And have a good rest of the day.